Calm returns to the streets of Paris and cities across France, but lingering questions remain after the police shooting death of a 17-year-old boy. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The French Interior Ministry says last week's protest resulted in 5,000 vehicles torched, more than 1,000 buildings damaged, and over 3,000 arrests. Protests turned violent in Paris and cities across France after a 17-year-old boy of Algerian descent was shot and killed by a police officer during a traffic stop. The shooting was recorded on video. The United Nations has called on France to address the country's deep issues of racism and discrimination in law enforcement. We begin with this report from CGTN's Evangelo Sipsas in Lyon, France.
Bilal likes to take a stroll in his neighborhood after work and kick the ball around with his friends. He works at Lyon's International Airport, where he puts in many hours. But for the past week, he has been doing overtime during the night, protesting.
People think the youth people protest because one of them was dead by by a policeman in Paris, in Nanterre, and that is the wrong thing, because this is really the last point. There are many problems before.
He says people like him, of African descent, feel like second-class citizens.
I think the problem of we are just Africans, or we are just from other countries. There are very big problems on France. They will persist this problem. We need to change this vision. People think we are immigrants, but we are all French. We are from France. I was born in France. I was born in Lyon.
Parts of the city are now showing the scars of that frustration. Broken windows, plywood covering up shops, and graffiti saying, "Justice for Nael," and "No justice, no peace," following the fatal police shooting of the teenage bike courier last week. Although things are now calm and the cleanup has begun, there is anger about alleged police brutality and racial discrimination. Something that business owners in this area feel different about.
Right now we feel safe. We know that when something like that happens, you get a lot of police almost immediately. Sometimes they come to see us and tell us, okay, maybe you should take away the price, maybe you should take away all your mannequins.
But the same feeling isn't shared by the wider community dominated by North African descent. Despite being born in France and growing up here, many feel that they're isolated and abandoned by the country's institutions.
I think young people have a feeling of total abandonment and rupture. Some of them think they don't have anything to lose. But this is just a minority of the youth. The large and visible majority manage to integrate, to have an education and a certain success in society. But those don't make the headlines.
The shooting has brought up deep-seated divisions. The government of Emmanuel Macron says it's seeking harsh punishments for those involved in the rioting, leaving people worried about what the death of one man really says about the lives of many. Evangelo Sipsas for CGTN, Lyon, France.
Well, for more now, let's bring in our Paris-based panel. Joav Toker is an associate professor with the American Graduate School of International Affairs and Diplomacy. Also with us, Richard Worley is an international correspondent for the Swiss Daily Blick. Yves Sintomer is a professor of political science at Paris 8 University, and Alexis Poulin is the founder of Le Monde Moderne media. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Alexis, let me start with you. It's been a week since the shooting death of 17-year-old Nahel Mezouk. He was shot, as we reported, by a policeman at a traffic stop. What can you tell us about the mood in the country? Of course, there have been several nights of very serious unrest across France, but what's the mood like in the country right now?
Well, so far the mood has been divided between the unrest, of course, the riots and the revolt of the young kids from suburbs, saying that it was enough with police violence, and this young kid being killed was too much. And on the other side, there is a lot of overtly racist people coming out, and from the politician side as well. We've heard a lot of elected people in France saying that the problem was about kids from immigration, was about these people in the suburbs, and I think the debate is kindly flawed, because the main debate is about police violence and about inequalities. But since we have a media landscape and a lot of people on the political scape on the right trying to run behind Marine Le Pen, which is the far right, they are all trying to steal the debate and say that it's all about Islam, it's all about immigration, it's all about kids not wanted to be French. And I think this is not helping at all to have a good debate on what happened really, which is about police violence, about integration, about what is France in the end.
Alexis, would it be fair to say then that divisions have deepened? There's even more polarization right now. But at the same time, are people looking for solutions, looking ahead?
Well, yes, some people are looking for solutions. For example, the left party, the NUPES, proposed to have a plan about the police violence to address the problem. But if you look at the government, the answer is denial. The Ministry of Interior, Gérald Darmanin, the head of police forces, and even Emmanuel Macron are all saying that there is no racism, no systematic racism in the French police, and there is no debate there. And I think that is the main issue, is that we won't have the correct debate. We will have more laws that will prevent freedom and freedom of expression, but not the debate on the real issue, which is about police violence and racism. And that is very, very alarming for the future of the country.
Joav Toker, what is your view on that? Is France going to get even more repressive right now, introduce more laws to prevent a recurrence of what happened, when they should be addressing things like racism, discrimination, police violence?
Well, my guess is that one way or the other, there would be a repressive volume which is going to be added up to the overall scene, due to the fact that actually there's big confusion, I would say, although nobody would spell it out this way and admit confusion. I would even say that the level of confusion and the effort to look for solutions is really now behind the effort to look for explanations. Solutions will come almost automatically through the traditional repressive apparatus, which will probably be reinforced, which will give some kind of answer to some of the voices we hear on the right and the extreme right, which are traditionally calling, spelling it out as an immigration-related set of issues, which is not at all the case according to a long list of research efforts for decades. Then on the left-hand side of the political scene, you also have all kind of how should I say, of doubtful sorts of initiatives. For example, one of the major leaders of the left, NUPES party, my colleague just referred to, refused all along the very tense 4 or 5 days of extreme violence to call for calm, for reasons which were dialectically explained in a very strange way. This is a man, Mr. Mélenchon, who has a considerable amount of influence over the entire French left. So the problem, I think, the specificity of what has happened last week in comparison to other very tense moments in the suburbs and in terms of the questions regarding systemic racism or not, is actually the very extremely young age of rioters, and to some extent, enigmatically, the fact that you didn't hear a coherent discourse of these very young rioters. Of course, there was protest after the tragic death of the 17-year-old young man, but you didn't hear a coherent set of claims which were new.
Okay, Richard Worley, you know, when we look at this kind of civil unrest, which took place across the country, with very high levels of violence, it's a time when a country's institutions are often tested. I mean, if we look at the situation right now, 3,000 people have been arrested. The average age of those who've been arrested is 17. Half do not have a criminal record. What will happen to them? How will they be treated by the French judicial system? I mean, what charges would they face in the first place?
Well, as far as the people who have been apprehended by the police, a number of them, I would say probably a good third of them, have been directly sent to court under a French procedure where you can be sent to court immediately after being arrested. And I went myself at the Nanterre court on Sunday to witness and to see how it's happened. So I had about 30 cases in front of me, 30 young men, all of them adults, I must say, because minors do not have the same way of being judged. And those adults, they were sentenced either to prison directly, few months of jail, and the other had either to work for government for a while, like 200 hours of work for government, or many of them were released. It does not mean that they went out free. It means that they will have to come to court later on, probably in August, because the problem in this very, I would say, urgent procedure is that very often the police are sending, not proper documents. They are quickly written, signature is not there. For example, today, as we speak, this evening, there is a prominent case of a person who was taken during a riot. He was filmed on video surveillance, and he was released for bail for a while by the judge because the notification was not properly signed by the prosecutor. So that means that when you enter in court, whatever you see in the street is treated differently because law is a difficult matter. So I would like to come back a bit on what you said to describe the atmosphere here in France. First of all, we've got to keep in mind the extent of the damages. You mentioned the number of buildings that were burned, the number of cars, and I would describe the feeling of the people as fear and anxiety. The French people are afraid of what they have seen during those last days. Many of them do not understand how it could happen. Sure, there is this statement and this reality of police violence, the difficulty in those suburbs, but many of the French people you would talk to would say that they don't understand, and they try to understand what went on. And there is also anxiety because we are just 10 days before 14th of July, Bastille Day, French National Day, with a lot of fireworks, as you know, with the military parade on the Champs-Élysées. And I can tell you that at the government level, they are very afraid of what may come next around this date.
Yves, Sintomer, tens of thousands of police were deployed during the unrest, during the riots that we saw, many of them from specialized units. Shortly afterwards, President Macron said that he would like to see restrictions on social media because in many instances social media was used to organize people on the streets. I mean, what do you make of the initial reaction of the French authorities?
You know, Macron, the difference with Sarkozy when the last national riots happened in 2005, tried to have balanced reaction, saying that the murder of the young man was terrible, but also saying that the violence is not legitimate and that repression was legitimate. The problem is that all governments, from the left, from the right, from the center, since years, have not done much to face the situation in the so-called banlieue, in the suburbs, the poor suburbs in France. Buildings are much better now. Public transportation is improving, but the network of NGOs and community associations has weakened. So the main answer is more repression than tackling the real problems. The other dimension is that the French police has a strategy since a couple of years which is much more repressive than it used to be, and compared to the strategy of the German police or the English police, it's much more repressive. We have to keep in mind that still, in France, in the last decade, around 15 persons per year were killed by the police. It was more than twice the number compared to England, but in the US, it's 1,150. So, you know, we have a difficult situation.
Alexis, I want to get back to something that Richard Worley was talking about a moment ago, and that is, you know, the atmosphere in France. And he said, look, the dominant atmosphere right now among the majority of French people is one of fear and anxiety. And in many instances, one could imagine that they are in a state of shock, that when they look at the level of violence that took place across the country. I mean, does that tell us, does that indicate to us that there is a failure to recognize the suffering that people go through in some parts of the cities and the country, and the level of resentment in those areas?
Clearly, yes. The main issue is that the debate is flawed. We have a part of the French population that think that the rioters have nothing to do about politics, and that they're just here for looting, and they don't like France, and they have nothing to do in France, and this is something that is going towards a civil war. And it's not really that. I think inflation, the state of the economy in France, is the real problem. You have 500 families that are the richest family in France that have doubled their fortune since Emmanuel Macron was elected, while French people are not buying as much food as they were in 2022. So the rise of inequalities, the rise of the economic problems is part of the problem. And I was talking about police violence, the fact that you had a lot of French people who had the feeling that they were second-class citizens because of the treatment they had by the police, by the state, by a lot of French people telling them that they were not first-class citizens. I think that is the main issue. And since we can't have the debate, because a lot of the political debate is hijacked by the extreme right, which is really fierce on this issue, and it has been for years, it's very difficult to find solutions. And Emmanuel Macron also doesn't want to address the issue about racism in the police forces, because he trusts the police forces. He needs the police forces to stay in power. And I think that is the main issue, is that we won't get the right debate. We will drive through fear, anger, then lack of liberties, repression, whatever. But the real debate is about freedom and respect.
Joav Toker, President Macron, of course, cannot run for re-election because of term limits. But if we look at what's happened in France over the last few months, there have been several groups that have demonstrated on the streets. We had the Yellow Jackets demonstrations, then we had the demonstrations against the pension reforms, and now, of course, we've had these demonstrations following the death of this 17-year-old youth. But even the fact that Macron is not going to be running for election, will there be any political fallout?
Oh yeah, certainly, and you're very pertinent in just describing the fact that we are actually, since Macron arrived in power about 6 years ago in 2017, we actually have a series of crisis after crisis after crisis. Most of these are expressing themselves in a violent way down the streets, and you just have to add the COVID, of course, crisis as a supplementary one of a completely different nature. But I think that as France is indeed in a state of confusion, and some may even say fear and anxiety, although I wouldn't go that far in terms of describing the French population right now under clouds of anxiety. I think that it would be well more exaggerated than the real situation is. I think that we have to, in order to understand, we have to turn the projectors over larger perimeters. I think that we cannot understand what happened in France these last days, for example, without several global elements, or let me say even more exactly, American elements. I think that the Black Lives Matter movement in America had a very important impact all over the Western world, and specifically in France, indeed, where there is a large a proportion of the young population, the population generally speaking, of foreign origin. I mean, that has been the case for decades now. So it's not really, and you add to that, of course, the historization aspect which modern social network media add up to.
Yeah.
And you actually see it very clearly if you follow in real time what have happened over these 4 extremely violent nights last week. So we have to pour these into the picture in order to try and better understand, but we're not yet there.
Yves, Sintomer, there are lawmakers who are expressing deep frustration with the Macron government. Let's listen to what some lawmakers had to say.
What makes me sad is that there is a young man who died a week ago, and once again, no lesson has been learned by this government. And with that, unfortunately, this situation risks being repeated.
This situation is not the result of chance. It's the consequence of the last 30 years of policies in our country, or maybe more. Policies on security, policies on immigration, the city's policies. It's a failure, and today, Madame Borne is not only co-responsible, but her government is in the situation that we find ourselves and our country in.
So listening to those sentiments there, Yves, do you think they would resonate with the French public? Do you think there is some kind of recognition that things cannot continue as they are right now?
I do think so. And it's clear that the problem is political. As it was said, these young people have legitimately the feeling that they are second-class citizens, that the police is like an occupied force in these neighborhoods. The problem is that the reaction is not clearly political. Namely, there were young men, not women, and it was not quite clear beyond the protest what was the possibility of reform. And in all political parties and tendencies, this was not that clear neither. So I do think that a lot of people living in these neighborhoods understand the hunger of this young man. But on the other hand, they also see that the things they destroyed is things that they used in the everyday life. Buses, social centers, schools, right, and so on and so forth. And those who don't live in these neighborhoods have difficulties to understand this. So I think that the situation is in a deadlock, and that much probably it will be the far right which could take advantage of these events.
Okay, Richard Worley, according to a report in the French media, in fact I saw this in the English language version of Le Monde, President Emmanuel Macron is considering imposing financial penalties on the families of those involved in these riots and unrest. I mean, it almost borders on collective punishment. It's outraged the left in France, but do you think that would get any traction at all?
Well, first of all, it is not the first time that this type of measure is being proposed by the government. Normally, it's being proposed by the right and the extreme right. So Emmanuel Macron, by saying this, clearly shifts politically from the center to the right. The difficulty with that is that it makes no sense. Why? Because most of those families, even if you consider that it would be proper to inflict financial penalty, which I think should clearly be debated, but even if you are in favor of, you must realize that most of those families in difficulty in these suburbs, they have no financial means to survive. I mean, they have difficulty to survive. They have low-paid jobs. They have difficulty to pay their apartment, and they have often kids that are difficult to manage. So imagining or thinking that by inflicting sanctions financial sanction, you will change something, is dreaming. The difficulty in reality, and that's why I insist on the word anxiety.
Yeah.
French people are not necessarily anxious about what happened in Nanterre. They believe it's now over for the while, but they're really worried. Can France hold together? Can French society still stick together? In French, they say, can we make society? And I believe that's the main question. And clearly, with that proposal from Emmanuel Macron, if to start to put the finger at a specific part of society, you will only fracture more the country. You will not bring it together.
Alexis, President Macron was in Marseille in the south of France not so long ago. It's a city which is considered by many to be a hotbed of a great deal of anger and disenchantment among immigrants and the children of immigrants and disenchantment with the French system. President Macron said during that visit that he recognizes that there are serious problems. In fact, during that visit, he promised $5.4 billion to start up a program to help young people. And today, Thursday, this is what he said.
We have all lived through an important moment in the life of the nation, so we will continue to work. First of all, the first response is order, calm and harmony, and then it's to work on the root causes of what happened.
So do you think anything will happen in terms of finding the root causes of what happened?
No, I don't think so. I think clearly Emmanuel Macron is not the right person at the right place for this issue. The French state has not been working on the main issue. If you look at the suburb ecosystem, which is the parallel economy, being drug dealing mainly, and also really a parallel economy, and nothing has been done against the mafia business. So you can pour millions of dollars in these suburbs and territories and pretend that this is a policy and it will work. It will not work, and this is where we are now, because not so much money, but a lot of money has been spent on these suburbs, but nothing happened. And in 2018, there was a report made by Jean-Louis Borloo, a French politician, about the suburbs, and Emmanuel Macron decided to bury the report and say, I don't want to talk about the report right now, this is not very important. So the root causes of what happened really, I think, is inequality and the lack of respect and racism in French society. And so far, the government doesn't want to address this issue.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.